Here's a question that the mental health space rarely answers with precision. Why do humans across completely different cultures, languages, family structures, and personal histories consistently develop the same small set of behaviors? And why do those behaviors almost always feel, to the people who have them, like personality rather than pattern? Not dramatic dysfunction, not obvious trauma, the quiet kind, the daily kind. The behaviors that look completely normal from the outside and feel completely natural from the inside, until the moment they don't, and by then they've been running the system for so long that you don't know where the behavior ends and you begin. A neuroscientist in Tokyo and a psychologist in Sao Paulo examining the same data arrive at the same uncomfortable conclusion. The behaviors most likely to convert ordinary experience into lasting psychological constraint are not the ones that feel wrong. They're the ones that feel like adaptation, because adaptation is exactly what they were once. The question worth asking is whether they still are. Subscribe to this channel, and because the answers developed here are not the comfortable ones, and that's precisely why they're useful. To understand why certain behavioral patterns become psychological limitations, you need to understand a specific and frequently misunderstood mechanism. The nervous system does not require severe or repeated trauma to automate a response. It requires sufficient repetition of a specific emotional state combined with the absence of a corrective experience. Here is what that means concretely. When your nervous system learns, through any combination of early experience, modeled behavior, or environmental reinforcement, that a particular emotional state carries threat, it develops a default response to that state. Suppress it, distract from it, seek external regulation for it, avoid the situations that produce it. This response, when activated frequently enough, becomes neurologically efficient. The brain automates what it repeats. That's not a flaw. That's the fundamental architecture of adaptive learning. The problem is that the brain does not automatically distinguish between behaviors that remain useful and behaviors that have outlived their function. It continues optimizing for the pattern regardless of whether the original threat still exists. The adult nervous system can be running a behavioral program designed for an environment that ceased to exist 20 years ago, and running it efficiently enough that nothing about it feels automatic. It feels chosen. Japanese psychological tradition describes this through a concept without precise English equivalent. The idea that undigested experience does not disappear, but changes form. It moves from conscious event into behavioral structure. The concept is not mystical. It maps precisely onto what contemporary trauma research identifies as dysregulated nervous system states, where the body remains organized around threat patterns that no longer correspond to the actual demands of the current environment. What makes the 7 behaviors in this video particularly resistant to identification is that they were selected by the nervous system precisely because they worked. They reduced the immediate experience of threat. They allowed continued functioning in environments where full emotional engagement was not available or safe. The question is not whether they were rational adaptations. They were. The question is what the cost of maintaining them looks like when the original environment is gone. The first behavior is emotional suppression, not as a deliberate contextual choice, but as a default neurological response to emotional activation. The body registers a feeling. The system immediately routes around it. Consciously, this registers as control, as the ability to function under pressure, as not letting things affect you. Neurologically, it is the repeated inhibition of signal processing through the interoceptive pathways, the systems that translate internal bodily states into conscious emotional experience. The research here is extensive and consistent. Suppression does not diminish emotional activation. It maintains it at a physiological level while preventing conscious processing. The cardiovascular cost of habitual emotional suppression is measurable and documented. Cortisol profiles in individuals with high habitual suppression show patterns characteristic of chronic stress, independent of whether any acute stressor is present. The body is running a background process that never reaches completion, and that process consumes real resources. What Japanese psychological practice recognized long before Western research confirmed it is that emotional regulation is a skill, not a trait. The concept of kansha, the deliberate cultivation of awareness and appreciation of emotional states, operates on the assumption that emotions require active engagement rather than management through avoidance. That distinction is not semantic. Active engagement with an emotional state activates prefrontal regulatory processes. Habitual suppression routes around those processes through amygdala-driven inhibition sequences. One reduces the emotional signal through completion, the other maintains it through containment, indefinitely. The second behavior is rumination, not reflection, not analysis. Rumination specifically. The distinction matters and is worth making precisely. Reflection moves. It begins at point A and arrives at point B that is meaningfully different from the starting point. Rumination loops. It always returns to where it began, occasionally with slight variations in route, but without producing a different destination. The neuroscience here is specific. The default mode network, the set of brain regions active during rest and self-referential thought, is disproportionately active in chronic ruminators. This is not incidental. The default mode network is responsible for perspective taking, narrative construction, and perspective simulation, all cognitively sophisticated functions in the service of rumination. These functions loop without resolution because the core input is an emotional state that has not been processed to completion. What the brain is attempting through rumination is not irrational. It is searching for the narrative frame that would make the experience intelligible, and therefore safe. The problem is that emotional processing cannot be accomplished through narrative construction alone. The physiological component of the emotional state, the bodily activation pattern, must also be regulated for processing to reach completion. Rumination generates narrative without regulating physiology. The loop continues because the exit condition, emotional completion, and is never reached through this route. Mono no aware, the Japanese aesthetic concept often translated as poignant awareness of impermanence, functions at the psychological level as a corrective to this pattern. It does not eliminate the grief of loss or the pain of what has passed. It contextualizes them within a frame that allows the emotional state to be fully felt and then released. The mechanism, translated into neurological terms, is the difference between sitting with an emotion through its complete physiological arc and attempting to think around it until the thinking produces resolution. The first works, the second doesn't. And the proof is in how long the loop continues. The third behavior is compulsive distraction. What makes this pattern particularly relevant now is that the stimulation available to interrupt uncomfortable emotional states is specifically engineered, at scale, to exploit the dopaminergic pathways that regulate attention and reward. The mechanism itself is straightforward. Uncomfortable emotional state activates. External stimulation is introduced, the reward circuit engages, attention reroutes, the emotional state temporarily recedes. The nervous system learns this sequence. Over sufficient repetitions, it begins to activate the seeking behavior proactively, before the emotional state reaches conscious awareness. The threshold for triggering avoidance drops with each repetition. The tolerance for undistracted internal experience diminishes accordingly. What is being trained at the neurological level through this process is not relaxation or pleasure. It is avoidance efficiency. The emotional content that was interrupted does not disappear. It accumulates. The practical consequence is a progressively lower capacity for emotional self-regulation in the absence of external stimulation, combined with a progressively higher stimulation requirement to achieve the same regulatory effect. The pattern is structurally identical to tolerance development in pharmacological dependency, which is not coincidental. The fourth behavior, in external validation dependency, is the interpersonal equivalent of the previous pattern. Where compulsive distraction routes around internal discomfort through sensory stimulation, external validation dependency routes around it through social approval. The function is identical. The uncomfortable internal state, uncertainty about one's own adequacy, worth, or accuracy of perception, is temporarily resolved through external confirmation rather than internal processing. The attachment research on this pattern is extensive. Individuals whose early attachment relationships were characterized by inconsistent responsiveness, where the caregiver's attunement was unpredictable, develop what attachment theorists call anxious attachment, heightened vigilance to social signals, amplified sensitivity to approval and rejection, and a reduced capacity to self-regulate in the absence of relational feedback. This is the most rational adaptation available to a developing nervous system that has learned social approval is the primary accessible source of emotional regulation. The problem arises when the adaptation persists into contexts where internal regulation is both possible and necessary, and specifically into adulthood and into relationships that require functional autonomy. The fifth behavior is punitive self-criticism, and what psychologists identify as the self-critical inner voice, and what neuroimaging research is increasingly identifying as a threat response originating in the same neural circuits activated by external threat. This is not metaphorical. Studies examining self-directed harsh criticism show amygdala activation patterns comparable to those produced by external threat perception. The physiological stress response, cortisol secretion, autonomic arousal, immune suppression, does not distinguish meaningfully between being threatened and threatening yourself. The paradox is that punitive self-criticism is commonly experienced and culturally presented as a form of quality control, as evidence of high standards, as the responsible alternative to complacency. The Kaizen model from Japanese industrial and personal development practice provides a direct counterexample. Continuous improvement in the Kaizen framework is built on the assumption that the analysis of error must be emotionally neutral to be functionally useful. Emotional charge in error analysis, specifically shame or self-condemnation, degrades the quality of the analysis by converting the error from a data point into a referendum on worth. A referendum cannot generate the specific actionable information that improvement requires. The shame consumes the cognitive resources that would otherwise produce the insight. The sixth behavior, emotional enmeshment, is the interpersonal boundary failure that presents as empathy. The mirror neuron system, which underlies the human capacity for social attunement, operates by simulating the internal states of others within our own neurological architecture. This is the mechanism of genuine empathy. We understand what others feel because, at a neurological level, we briefly model what they feel within our own system. Emotional enmeshment is the failure to maintain a clear functional boundary between this simulation and one's own internal state. The simulation becomes indistinguishable from personal experience. The other person's distress registers not as something observed and understood, but as something shared and owned, with the full physiological activation that implies. The Japanese concept of uchisodo, the distinction between one's internal world and the external world of others, provides a useful framework that is not about emotional distance, but about clarity of attribution, knowing that you are experiencing resonance with someone else's state, rather than experiencing your own original state, is the prerequisite for genuine compassionate presence. Without that clarity, what presents as support is often a form of emotional merger that burdens both parties. One who needs support and cannot access it clearly, and one who is managing their own dysregulation while believing they are managing the others. The seventh behavior is what trauma research identifies as the fawn response. The conflict avoidance pattern that manifests as the systematic circumvention of conversations that could produce interpersonal tension. Unlike the fight and flight responses, the fawn response is socially sanctioned and frequently misidentified as consideration, tact, or maturity. It involves the automatic movement toward appeasement and accommodation in the presence of interpersonal tension, regardless of whether the tension represents actual threat. Like all behaviors on this list, the fawn response was adaptive in the environments that produced it. Where conflict generated real threat, physical, relational, or emotional, the capacity to de-escalate quickly through accommodation was functionally protective. The problem is that the nervous system does not automatically update this response when the environmental threat level changes. The adult carrying a fawn adaptation continues to appease in contexts that don't require it, avoids conversations that could actually resolve chronic relational tension, and accumulates resentment precisely proportional to the accommodation that was never freely chosen. The Japanese concept of mei, the pause, the space between things, the deliberate gap before response, is not conflict avoidance. It is the creation of regulated space before engagement. The distinction is functionally significant. Avoidance eliminates the necessary conversation entirely. Ma makes the conversation possible by ensuring it happens from a regulated rather than reactive state, which changes both what gets said and what gets heard. The question this video opened with, why do these behaviors feel like personality rather than pattern, now has a precise answer. They feel like personality because they were selected early, repeated consistently, and automated efficiently by a nervous system doing exactly what nervous systems do, finding the most effective route through a specific environment. The behaviors are not evidence of weakness or dysfunction. They are evidence of successful adaptation to conditions that may no longer exist. What the neuroscience adds to this observation is the mechanism, and mechanism matters because mechanism is modifiable. You cannot change what you experienced. You can change how the nervous system processes what you experience going forward through the deliberate, sustained practice of alternative responses, repeated long enough for the nervous system to develop and reinforce new pathways, not replacement of existing patterns. Supplementation. The old responses remain encoded. They simply stop being the only available option. That shift from automatic to chosen is what the elimination of these behaviors actually means, not the elimination of feeling or of protective capacity, the recovery of choice about what to do with what you feel. If what you watched today mapped onto something you recognize in yourself, the most useful immediate step is observation rather than intervention, watching these patterns operate in real time without judgment, as the prerequisite to everything that comes after. Share this with someone who might benefit from the same shift in perspective. Next week, this channel examines the somatic dimension of what you saw today, how the body encodes what the mind avoids, and what specific practices that understanding actually makes possible, because knowing the mechanism is step one. Step two is knowing precisely where to apply the lever.